Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Elmhurst Congressional Q&A. I am Patty Lackman from the League of Women Voters of Central Kane County. I will be asking the questions tonight. The city of Elmhurst has been in and out of the 6th Congressional District several times. Currently, about half of Elmhurst, the part west of York Road, is in the 6th District. Sean Casten represents the 6th Congressional District and was elected to it in November of 2018. The east side of York Road is the 4th Congressional District, which is new to Elmhurst and is represented by Representative Jesus Chuy Garcia. Representative Garcia was also elected in November of 2018. We are concerned about the lack of congressional input in the decisions that are being made in our capital. So we have requested that our representatives answer some questions about what is happening. These questions were proposed by the League, and community members also contributed. We are really thankful that Representative Casten has chosen to attend this Q&A with his constituents. Representative Garcia was unable to attend tonight. Good evening, Congressman Casten. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being able to visit with us tonight. We have several questions that have been submitted, as I indicated, and we'll start with an easy one on the economy. What can you tell us about the imminent shutdown of the government?
I can tell you that I hope that government doesn't shut down, and I fear that it will. This is now, I'm going into my 4th term. We have had, when I was first elected, we were in the midst of the longest shutdown in history. That was at the end of the 115th Congress going into the 117th and 118th, 116th, I'm sorry. And at the time, that was also the last time that Donald Trump was in the White House and the Republicans controlled both chambers. And obviously, I wasn't there when that one started, but there's a similar dynamic here that there are still some schisms within the Republican Party between the diehard fiscal hawks and the shall I say, culture warriors. And we cannot get the appropriations bills done unless it can get through both the House and the Senate. And there's really been no effort to work with the Democrats yet to pull something together. So the bills that have come forward are A, extremely partisan, B, would immediately cause the Obamacare tax credits to immediately go away, which would put a lot more people out of their health coverage, which is just hard in good conscience to support that. The making it more difficult is that historically, at least in my experience, members of Congress of different parties obviously have very different policy priorities, but we've all generally agreed that Congress is an important institution and should have power and controls the power of the purse. And because in this administration, the White House has consistently failed to distribute funds consistent with congressional law, and the Republican leadership has not done any oversight, a lot of what we've been trying to say to the Republicans is you have to put some kind of accountability in to have a negotiation. And we've just not gotten to that point. So we are going to go back to Washington on Monday. As of right now, Speaker Johnson says that the House will not be in session between now and when the fiscal year ends out on September 30th. If that's the case, then we won't be able to pass anything. You may have seen that Leader Jeffries and Leader Schumer requested a meeting with Trump to try to work through. He initially said yes, and then at the request of Johnson and Thune, went back on that pledge. So we're going to go, we're going to be there, we're going to be ready to open it up. But my fear at this point is that we will end up shutting down, and there will then be a fair amount of pain because a lot of things won't get funded. And I just have to hope that that pain doesn't last too long before saner heads prevail.
Yes, thank you. Talking about some of the potential cuts, what can we do to protect those impacted by the cuts in Medicaid currently?
So, I mean, the honest answer is you just have to elect people of good virtue. I went down and did a number of town halls in downstate districts earlier this term, and I was out in Darren LaHood's district and was down in Mike Boss' district, and I have about 135,000 constituents who I serve who are Medicaid beneficiaries. Mike Boss downstate has 200,000 constituents who are Medicaid beneficiaries. The funding to hospitals that depend on Medicaid it's going to hurt a lot up here, but it's going to hurt even more in the rural parts of the country because there's just not as many hospitals. If a hospital in Elmhurst shuts down, maybe you have to drive to LaGrange. If a hospital downstate shuts down and you have to drive 2 hours to Springfield, that's pretty soon that's a life-threatening problem. Um, I was I was both saddened and encouraged that when I did those downstate town halls, you had folks down there who were saying that they came because they wanted to make sure that I knew, even if their own rep wasn't doing town halls, of how painful those Medicaid cuts would be in rural America. And we just have to keep reminding them that we don't have to make those cuts, but those cuts are cemented into law. This very partial good news is that the way that the this bill that the Republicans passed, I don't want to use its name, was structured. The Medicaid cuts don't go into effect until after the midterm elections. The cuts to food assistance don't go into effect until after the next elections, but the tax cuts for billionaires go into effect right away. The I think that the political theory of the case when they did that was that it wouldn't hurt the next election. What's going to happen practically, and this is to your point about what can you do to try to mute this. Medicaid is the single largest item in the Illinois budget because Medicaid is a matching program that the feds pay half of it and the states pick up the other half. The second biggest line item in the Illinois budget is education. And so with those cuts coming, the folks in Springfield are going to have to figure out how to prioritize spending with a smaller pot of money. And so I expect there will be some really hard conversations in Springfield. I basically characterize it as Sophie's choice. You love all your children, but which one has to get cut? Is it going to be support for kids with disabilities? Is it going to be support for long-term care for senior citizens? Um, are they maybe going to find some ways to raise some revenue to offset? I don't know. But the meat of the question right now, as far as folks up here, is really getting in touch with your representation in Springfield about how can we make the most out of a terrible hand that's been dealt from Washington? And then in the meantime, we just have to get some accountability and elect some folks who are going to prioritize preserving people's health care. And I wish I had a better answer, but that's the practical reality because those cuts were made in the law, and I'm not going to encourage anybody who breaks the law.
Not very encouraging. What should we do to fight to protect Social Security? Can we fight to protect Social Security?
So, Social Security structurally and from an accounting perspective is outside of all of the other fiscal problems that we have as a country. The rising debt technically doesn't touch Social Security. Practically speaking, at some point, all these things connect. What I've always characterized Social Security as an extremely progressive program funded with an extremely regressive tax. It's progressive because it makes sure that every American, when they get to the point where they're ready to retire, they want some, they've paid their dues to society, maybe for some reason they're not able to continue working, that we gives them some dignity in those final years. And so in that sense, it's very progressive. It's regressive in the sense that what we pay into Social Security is only paid on the first roughly $180,000 of our income, and then you don't pay any more after that. So if you make $180,000 a year, you contribute the same amount to the Social Security Trust Fund that Elon Musk does. You both pay on the first $180,000 of your income. And so the wealthier you are, the less you contribute to a program that's designed to help folks who deserve a little bit more. And there's an obvious solution to that. And we've had a bill that I think I've co-sponsored every term in Congress. I regret to this day that we were not able to get it out of the Ways and Means Committee and onto the floor when we had the majority, but let's put some pressure on to do it next time, which is a bill that Congressman Larson from Connecticut has that would maintain the current structure, but then say once you make over 400,000, you're going to start contributing again. So you don't have big sticker shock for folks who are in between. And in the current structure, that 180,000-ish number grows with inflation every year. So eventually you close that gap. That largely solves the solvency program for Social Security and makes sure that this program can stick around. If we don't do that, for some reason we can't, I think we're going to be forced into making some sort of cuts. If we have to do that, I think the most equitable way would be to do some sort of means testing that says, let's make sure that if we have to do those cuts, make sure that we cut first from the people who have got some other wealth and can get by without that payment, which isn't the way Social Security was designed. Remember, it was supposed to be one leg of a three-legged stool. Um, but I think we may be forced to do something like that if we don't find a better solution. But I'm putting all my efforts into trying to make sure that we solve this through door one.
Thank you. Let's move on to foreign policy. Do you support providing material support to Ukraine? If so, in what form?
Absolutely. I've consistently supported Ukrainian aid. Um, I think it's worth pointing out that we might not have a democracy today, but for Ukraine. If you recall, 2 election cycles ago, Donald Trump called Zelensky and said, "I need you to do a favor for me. And if you don't do that favor, I'm going to withhold military aid." Zelensky, knowing all the threats he was under, didn't flinch. And that, of course, became the cause of Trump's first impeachment. And I think we owe a lot of gratitude to Ukraine for making sure that he was going to uphold the rule of law, even if the president of the United States wasn't, which is just a tremendous amount of courage, not to mention all the courage he's shown since. I think there's a larger foreign policy reason that the United States is a member of NATO. We've signed Article 5 that says an attack on one member of the NATO alliance is an attack on all, and we will all defend. Ukraine is surrounded by NATO allies. We are seeing Russia make encroachments into NATO allies like Poland right now, testing whether or not our resolve is going to be there to defend NATO. And what Ukraine has done to fight back with American resistance, with American assistance, has substantially weakened Russia's ability to push into Europe, and sent a signal, for the most part, that the United States is still going to be a strong defender of the NATO alliance. I say for the most part because obviously the current president has been somewhat inconsistent on that. But of course, under Joe Biden, we saw, countries like Sweden and Finland that had always been outside of NATO join in because they understood the threat of NATO and they understood how important that was. If we don't protect NATO in this moment and Russia moves beyond that, um, we are going to find ourselves in a situation where, in addition to committing American weapons, we're committing American troops because that's the obligation we have under NATO. And I think we should all be grateful for what Ukraine's done to stand against that and continue to be the country that says that there is a rule of law. We're going to respect country's territorial integrity. And if people are going to breach that, we're going to be the person who's defending that rule of law.
Will you support a ban on providing military aid to Israel?
I absolutely support enforcing the Leahy Act, which we have done a poor job of doing, which says that when we provide military assistance to other countries, they have to conform with international law and human rights law. We've not done as good as that as we should, but the United States provides military aid to a lot of countries who we don't always agree with politically, but there are reasons we provide. Places like Egypt, we send a lot of military aid, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Um, uh, what what the Netanyahu administration is doing right now, is abhorrent. I think they were completely in their rights to defend themselves from October 7th, and they are completely beyond the pale in what they're doing in Gaza. But I think we need to separate what the administration is doing from our allegiance to Israel in the same way that I would submit we should separate what Hamas did from our allegiance to the Palestinian people. Um, and so, I continue to support aid to Israel. I have voted against aid to Israel when it didn't include humanitarian packages. I voted against aid to Israel when it had what, in my judgment, was far too much focus on offensive weapons. So that's not to say that it's a unilateral rubber stamp. Um, but I don't support simply cutting off aid.
Let's move on to immigration. What can be done about racial profiling?
Um, there are so many things that can be done in the law, and then the question is what we do, with this administration right now. I think the most important thing we can do is, as people in positions of public authority, is to show by our own actions that we treat people with dignity, to model the behavior we expect to see from others. And I'm not going to suggest that's enough, but when we have a White House that is grossly violating the law, that is sending ICE officers out without identification, wearing face masks, that's detaining people without identifying who those people are. We're trying right now. I was supposed to be meeting with ICE officials tomorrow. They have just canceled the meeting, but we were trying to get a meeting with them specifically because we need to get information of who they are holding. Um, and have they been through due process? Are they citizens or not? We don't even know the answers to those questions. And we're going to continue to fight and use our voice to do that. But the law itself is very clear, right? We all have a 14th Amendment right to equal protection. We all have a right to due process. We all have a right to no unlawful search and seizure. But if the Department of Justice is not obeying those laws, then Congress should be doing oversight. We've tried to do oversight. We've pushed the administration. We have not been able to succeed in getting our Republican colleagues, who ultimately control whether any given committee will issue a subpoena, um, to stand up to the excesses of the Trump administration. So we're going to keep making noise. We're going to keep trying to persuade. And it pains me that there's not more that we can do other than depend on the courts. On the court side, I would simply add that I've lost track of how many amicus briefs we've submitted to the courts, a lot of work that we did from the end of the last administration to this one, going page by page through Project 2025 to identify where we thought the Trump administration might go, and working with outside legal groups to make sure that we were prepared to counter those in courts, to identify people who had standing. And so while we've not succeeded everywhere in the courts, the fact that we've had as much success as we had is because we were prepared in anticipation of this moment. And you need to continue to rely on the courts where we can to be the co-equal branch that the Republican leadership in the House and Senate is at present somewhat unwilling to be.
In the present political climate, is there any form of legislation to curb, is any form of legislation to curb gun violence possible?
Um, to some degree, the proof is in the pudding. We have passed on the floor of the House in every year that the Democrats were in the majority that I've been in the House, bills to provide universal background checks, bill to provide assault weapons bans, bills to close what's the Charleston loophole that says that if, right now, if you go through a background check and the check isn't done within 30 days, you're just automatically given a presumption of innocence and given a gun. All of those bills have been introduced again this term, and have not been marked up. We did have a bipartisan success after the Uvalde shooting, in I think it was called the Safer Communities Act, that was led by Senator Murphy. I forget who the Republican co-sponsor was, but it was bipartisan out of the Senate and in the House. It was a good bill. It was overwhelmingly focused on making sure that we get mental health resources to people who, might otherwise commit acts of violence, and that's important and necessary. I do worry, though, that it's bipartisan to treat this as a mental health problem. It's partisan to treat this as a gun problem, and the you know the analytical truth is that the best predictor that you're going to be a victim of gun violence is that you live in a community with a high penetration of guns. The highest rate of gun fatalities in the country on a per capita basis is in Wyoming, that also has the highest rate of gun ownership in the country. And in all of the states, the predominant cause of gun death is suicide. Um, Now, we can frame that as a mental health problem, which of course there are issues that are there. Um, I tend to view it more specifically as every one of us is capable of a bad day. Every one of us is capable of getting angry. Every one of us who has ever gotten angry has done something that we regretted later. But in the United States, we make it uniquely possible for someone who is having a bad day or who is angry to do something irreversible with a gun. And if we don't address the fact that we just have too many guns, we're not really going to solve the problem. If we took half of the guns in America away tomorrow, and just imagine how politically hard that would be, we would still have more guns per capita than every other country in the world.
Do you support a national assault weapon ban?
Absolutely, without reservation.
Should the federal government be included in providing equitable, quality education for all children?
Yes, without question. Now, how the government does that, given as historically uh, municipalities and states have been primarily responsible for funding education and primarily responsible for designing curriculum, which means that the federal government has various backdoor ways to ensure that we have equitable education. We've done that through programs to make sure that we have school lunches so that every kid who gets to school is in a position and ready to learn, making sure that we have support for um, kids with special needs who need after-school support. Those fundings go through making sure that schools have resources for the kinds of teachers that can address those needs. So those things the federal government can shore up. One of my fears right now that I think the federal government is going in the wrong direction is that there is a push um, to allow people to take tax dollars or to prioritize religious education. Religious education has always been treated as outside of the tax system. If you want to get a religious education, that's fine. Whatever religion you have, I have no beef with that. But I worry about some of this trend to say that if you move into a religious school or some other school, you should take your tax dollars with you because that has the risk of really decimating the funding sources for public education. And those sorts of pushes, both at the federal and state level, I think have the risk of really weakening public education in ways that could set us back. Um, look, when people talk, we want to make America back to what it was in the 50s when we were the leader of the world. A big part of that was the United States was the first country that provided universal K through 12 education. We had a head start in the rest of the world. We had a much more educated population. The rest of the world then not only copied us, but added pre-K and in some cases added college as well. And I think we're past time to look at sort of taking some lessons from those who we previously taught to try to expand out if we want to continue to be the place that not only attracts the best and brightest to our shores, but make sure that the people on our shores turn out to be the best and brightest as we go forward in a hopefully more optimistic future.
Should voting rights be addressed at the federal level?
Voting rights absolutely are addressed at the federal level. They're addressed through the Reconstruction Amendments that says every citizen of the United States, well, every citizen of the United States has the right to vote, and you can't infringe on that right to vote. It was addressed through the Reconstruction Amendments that said that which ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act, that said that you can't disenfranchise people either by all the things we did prior to the civil rights era, poll taxes, gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering. There has been a backlash against voting rights from the Roberts Court. They gutted the Shelby versus Holder decision that said that provided for preclearance of states that had, and I mean, this is really important. I want to sort of avoid the semantics. Under the Voting Rights Act for years, it said that states that have a history of discriminating against minorities have to get pre-clearance from the federal government before they design their congressional districts because they had a history of racially gerrymandering those districts to minimize the influence of African American voters. In the Shelby versus Holder decision, John Roberts wrote that we have now entered a post-racial era and we don't need the pre-clearance provisions anymore. Immediately after that decision, you saw a wave of redistricting, which led the same Roberts Court to then say that Alabama had illegally racially gerrymandered their state in the new maps, that Louisiana had illegally racially gerrymandered their states. And the court eventually ruled that they had to redo their maps, which brought two new African American members into Congress who wouldn't otherwise be there. It took them over a congressional cycle. So the Supreme Court allowed them to elect and place people based on maps that the Supreme Court themselves said violated the Voting Rights Act. And the court has never come back and say, oh, we messed up. It turns out we're not in a post-racial era. And the proof of that is that this same court concluded that, in fact, those states that historically required preclearance are still need to have preclearance from the federal government. So, yes, the federal government absolutely needs to jealously defend the provisions that make sure everybody has equal access to the ballot box. Um, and the Supreme Court has made that more difficult. We, we've brought forward laws to correct some of those excesses of the Supreme Court. Again, sort of like we were saying on the gun violence, we passed those laws out of the House when the Democrats were in the majority. We didn't have enough votes in the Senate to break the filibuster, and we've not been able to bring them up right now. So we need to bring them up again. And I would encourage people that, if we have majorities in the House and Senate in some future term that are committed to voting rights, let's remind the Senate that it's more important to protect the rights of 330 million Americans than it is to protect the rights of 40 senators to filibuster.
Can voting rights be protected as far as mail-in ballots and voting machines in Illinois?
Yes, and those rules are primarily state level rules. The president is talking a lot of bluster about mail-in ballots, but the Constitution and case law is pretty clear that the states have jurisdiction over the manner and process of elections. And so, you know, some states allow mail-in ballots, some states don't. Some states allow early voting, some states don't. States have different processes for, proving that you're eligible to be a voter, and that's pretty established. And so, and I feel pretty good about what Illinois has done. I'm particularly proud of what DuPage County has done where I live. It's become just, really, really easy that in DuPage now you can go to any polling place in the district and show up and you're in the system and the machine prints out a ballot that's specific to your precinct. It's wonderful because it makes sure that more of us can vote. We don't miss elections because we happened to work late and weren't close to the polling station that was right next to our house. So we can do more of that. A lot of that's at the state level. Um, I don't want to diminish the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House about pushing back on mail-in ballots, but I also think there's at least right now, I feel like there's more bluster than substance to that, given the mechanics of the way our elections work.
Can Illinois follow other states' lead and attempt redistricting? Do you believe that this would be wise?
Um, in theory, we could, and I look, we should have no gerrymandering anywhere. The choosing your voters is no way to run a democracy. Illinois is a state that allows partisan gerrymandering, as is Texas. There's a handful of states that allow partisan gerrymandering. The only thing worse than gerrymandering is unilateral disarmament. And so, given what the Texas legislature has done to gerrymander their state, I think it is appropriate to to do what California appears to be on a track to do with their Proposition 50. And to the extent that Illinois can, we should do that as well. But but not because that's a long-term solution, because the way to stand up to a bully is to say, I'm willing to play at your game, not back down, because then the bully comes back and picks your pocket again at lunch the next day. That's not the way to run a democracy, but I think it's the practical reality of where we are right now. I think one of the challenges, the Texas map is almost certainly a violation of the Voting Rights Act. There are specific minority districts that have been drawn out and are being challenged in court as we speak. We'll see what this court does in response to that. But what I think is important that we not do in Illinois or in California or in other states is to say that we will also violate the Voting Rights Act. It's one thing to say we'll gerrymander for partisan reasons. It's something else to say we're going to violate, the Constitution itself. And if you are committed to not violating the Voting Rights Act, there are fewer degrees of freedom, shall we say, just mathematically on the map. So we'll see what Illinois does, but it's not lost on me that, we're all of us candidates are out collecting petition signatures now. The deadline to submit your name to be on the ballot is coming up at the end of this month, and then we have a primary in March. So if Illinois were to do something, they would have to do it really quickly, and they almost certainly would have to change the whole process, which would scramble a lot of the electoral process. So you can draw your own conclusion about what's likely to happen, but I do think it's important um, not to lay down when the Constitution is the stakes that are on the line.
Let's go on to one of your favorite subjects, environment. Do you think that those in red states that have suffered severe damage from catastrophic storms actually have legislators that can be convinced to support legislation to curb climate change?
Um, there's a lot of pop psychology in that question, and I don't want to speculate how people think that I haven't met. Um, I I think it is unambiguously true that if you live in Florida, you are keenly aware of the risk of hurricanes and what that means. Even whether or not you connect it to climate change, you're aware of how high your insurance premiums are in your home. You're aware of the things you have to do to protect against a flood. I was out in North Carolina recently, meeting with the mayor of Asheville, looking at the catastrophic flooding that came through Helene, and talking about how do they possibly raise the money in that town for, I think they said they're going to need roughly $160 million to get their water treatment system fixed that completely flooded out. How are they going to rebuild those towns? You talk to the folks in Texas and all the young girls who were lost at that summer camp. No one is unaware that climate change is happening. Whether you connect the dots is a scientific question. Who you vote for, we got our own reasons for doing that go for different reasons. My general view is that the single best argument for people to act in their own selfish interests in the near term to address climate change is because anything you do to convert to an energy system that emits less CO2 is a decision to convert to an energy system that doesn't cost as much money. Um, if you put a solar panel on your roof, you don't have to pay for electricity anymore. If you put an electric vehicle in your driveway, you don't have to pay for gasoline anymore. If you insulate your house, you don't have to pay for as much natural gas anymore. Um, all of those things that we can and should do for environmental reasons, we also can and should do for purely selfish reasons. And we actually just introduced a fairly substantial bill this week, myself and Mike Levin, the Cheap Energy Act, that's designed to take away the barriers to installing cheap energy in America, because the hostility that the fossil fuel industry has to clean energy is not that it's clean, it's that cheap energy is kicking its butt. Coal use is down 50% in the United States over the last decade. Oil use hasn't grown. It's all getting squeezed out by cheaper sources, and they're fighting back to try to stop those sources from coming on the market. And so what Mike and I have done is said, let's change the rules so that everybody economically gains by deploying cheap energy, knowing that if we do that, that will lead to a deployment of clean energy, which will help slow down the rate of all those floods and all those wildfires, and maybe get to a point where we can turn the corner.
Do you think that there will be a try to enact a national ban on abortions? If so,
Um,
what can we do to oppose this?
the That is very clearly the goal. If you read Project 2025, what the Republicans would like to do, there was rhetoric that came out after the Dobbs decision that said we're just returning the rights to the states. Um, I made the point pretty forcefully at the time and continue to make the point that no one ever claimed that this was a states' rights issue. People claimed that it was a women's rights issue. And what it did was take rights away from women, and there's a continued push to push back against that. Because the Dobbs decision was framed as simply returning the decision to the states, we are now living in a country where your rights as a woman vary depending on where you live and where you happen to travel to when you need medical care. We are seeing some indications that um, that the Republicans would like to put a ban on mifepristone and some of the other medications that can facilitate abortion care. So far, that hasn't happened, but I think we got to be pretty vigilant about pushing back on that. Um, the single most important thing that we can and should do is take this away from the courts, who have proven themselves incapable of dealing with this, and fix it in the law. Um, the Women's Health Protection Act would provide all women protection under the law. The Equal Rights Act, arguably, had we ever, we can probably have a separate conversation of why it is that that hasn't been amended to the Constitution yet, but that would have provided women with additional protection as well. When we passed the Women's Health Protection Act in the House, which we passed twice in the last Congress, I'm sorry, two Congresses ago, I put a letter together to Senate leadership and got 100 of my fellow Democrats to sign on that said, you all have to get rid of the filibuster. Because as we were sitting there in that moment, at least based on what people said, we had 51 votes in the Senate that would have supported that bill because Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins on the Republican side had both indicated that they would also support it. Under Senate rules, though, it had to go through the filibuster. And so we basically made the argument to the senators that I mean, it's a variant of what I said about guns. 167 million women have rights, and that can't be sublimated before 40 senators who would like to be able to block a law. Manchin and Sinema were not on board. Schumer did not put pressure on him that I thought maybe he could have. I'm not a senator, I don't know. But the result is we didn't get that done. So if we get back to a point where we have the votes in the Senate to do this and the votes in the House, let's codify that into law so that we don't have to worry anymore about what Samuel Alito thinks about how you should live your life.
Tylenol causes autism?
No, it's embarrassing we have to ask the question, but absolutely not.
Came from the public here. It looks like we are losing our constitutional rights. What are the changes that need to be made to prevent fascism from taking over?
Um, so I'm going to be a little bit more uplifting here, but I got to take to a dark place to get there. There is every day there is another, we are deeper in a constitutional crisis. Jimmy Carter sold a peanut farm because of the emoluments clause of the Constitution. And Donald Trump has taken billions of dollars, I'm not exaggerating, in various crypto ventures just in this term. I'm not talking about what he did in his first term. Um, we've had a complete trampling on Congress's power of the purse. Congress is not doing oversight to stand up to that. Um, the lower courts are doing a good job. The Supreme Court has been disappointing so far. At their best, they've provided rulings that um, don't establish binding precedent, where all we know is we have to go back to the Supreme Court if the same question comes up again, which is problematic. And all of that puts our country and our Constitution in a very precarious situation as we approach our 250th birthday. My soft optimism that comes out of that is that we absolutely should be frightened by the fact that the executive branch is ignoring the Constitution. We absolutely should be frightened by the fact that the legislative branch, at least as long as the current majority is in power, is not doing oversight to stand up to the executive branch. And we absolutely should be frightened about the fact that the judicial branch is less than totally reliable. If we are surprised by that, we are probably white. Because I would remind you that, in the wake of the Civil War, when we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we then had a federal government that substantially did not afford equal protection to African Americans, that substantially did not make sure that African Americans had the full and equal right to vote that was guaranteed to them under those rules. And both the legislative branches and the judicial branch were complicit in allowing, what became Jim Crow and mass incarceration and a whole bunch of legacies, some of which we have resolved, some of which we're still living with today. That was also an attack on the Constitution. Um, to the extent we have grown from that period, it was because the folks who were most severely affected by those assaults on the Constitution didn't give up on America. that those people fought to force America to live up to its promise rather than giving up on the promise of America. And and it took 100 years, and it still is ongoing. But the reforms of the civil rights era, I think, is the point that we all take our inspiration from right now. And what I'm always struck when I have the privilege to go and represent the United States abroad. I've traveled an awful lot of places in this job, and what you consistently find when you talk to foreigners about what they admire about America, they don't say, I admire your president or your vice president. And it doesn't matter the party. I don't admire your elected officials as charming as I am. That's not what they admire about America. What they admire about America is that throughout our history, we have gone through stresses that would have broken other countries, and the American people have fought to preserve that idea. And that is no guarantee that we'll do it again, but we know what the playbook is, and the character of the American people has saved us before. And I've lately been every time I meet with young people and students, I've been reading this quote of James Madison's to them when he said, "The basic bet of a country based on the rule of law is that it depends on the virtue of the people who are implementing the law." And he goes on to say that it's a chimerical idea to assume that your leaders will all be virtuous. And that's why you have to count on the virtue of the people who select them.
Thank you. What should we be doing that you are not able to do? What should we be doing that you are not able to do?
I think the single most important thing for all of us who care about democracy and civil society to do is to be loudly courageous. There are so many people in our society who feel vulnerable right now. Maybe it's a maybe it's a family with mixed immigration status. Maybe it's a maybe it's a maybe it's a gay or trans kid who doesn't feel like he can share with his family or with his support group, you know, what he or she thinks about who he is as a person. And with all those people who are afraid, every time they see someone in a position of power give in to cowardice, when they see a law firm, a major law firm fold and say, yeah, I'll just agree to do work for Trump and I'll stop prosecuting cases against him. When they see a TV station decide to pull someone off the air because they said someone mean about Trump, that courage scares them and makes them more afraid. Every time they see someone stand up and do the right thing and fight back and win, and whether that's Jimmy Kimmel this week or some of the work that our governor has done to stand up, that courage also becomes contagious and infectious. And and I've do what you can do. Maybe that means that you're going to, go and hold some signs on the side of a street in a rally. Maybe it means that you're going to go. I was talking to some folks in Wheaton who got some faith leaders together to talk about what their various religions have to say about welcoming the stranger and looking out for the immigrant and speaking to people who come from a very religious tradition whose political views might be different than ours, but getting them to understand and see that. And then after they're done with that, bringing immigration lawyers up to say, okay, if there's anyone in the audience who needs to know, here's your rights, here's what you can demand if someone shows up at your door and wants you to open it. Those acts of courage matter because they give hope to people who are vulnerable. And as I've had basically the same conversation with university presidents and corporate CEOs who have all told me that they are offended by what the president is doing, but they can't afford to stand up because if they do, they won't be able to stay in business. They won't be able to support their employees. They won't be able to support their students. And my consistent response to them is that the fact that it is so rare for people who have something to lose to stand up, while that's a historical fact, it also means that if you don't, then you're sitting around waiting for someone with nothing left to lose to show you what leadership looks like. And leadership in this moment requires finding ways to stand up, finding ways to be courageous, finding ways to persuade people who maybe don't agree with you politically, which means opening your heart and showing them some grace to somebody who had a different yard sign than you had last election cycle. And if you do all that stuff, we'll get through this because I know there's more decency and love and dignity in this world than there is hatred. But people only know that if you say it out loud.
Thank you. What is the roadmap for stopping and then healing the fraction within the United States?
I think the ultimate answer is that we need to. I don't want to make this all about my own line of work because I think all of us have agency in this. But I would say that we have had political moments in our history where the highest elected officials in the country have spread division, have suggested that we're two separate Americas and you're either with me or against me. Obviously the worst of that was during the Civil War, but we've had other moments of division as well. And the the Americans we look to, regardless of your political persuasion, the Americans we look to who we think I really liked America when that person was leading us, almost universally are people who told a story that included all Americans and told us that we were all on the same team. Um, I, you know, I have plenty of political differences with Ronald Reagan, but it's hard to refute the sort of sunny optimism, morning America, that we're all in this together, that was out there. I suspect there are people who love Ronald Reagan who don't like Barack Obama, but who really respond to his message of we're not red America, we're not blue America, we're one America, or JFK's, exhortations. The I think having elected officials who remind us that there's something very special about being Americans that supersedes whatever little divisions we have is going to be real important. And I think we can all do that in our own individual life as well by just trying to find those areas of commonality. Frankly, I think one of the biggest risks to that right now has to do with our media environment. Um, in the short 7 years that I've been in Congress, I've watched my ability to reach everybody in the district equally just diminish and diminish and diminish. Um, I'll, I'll go on CNN with Jake Tapper and nobody sees it, and everybody used to see that all the time. That was just 7 years ago. We're on these social media channels that amplify people who agree with us and don't expose us to people who disagree with us. And so I think all of us have a role in trying to find ways to get into rooms where we don't know if everybody in the room agrees with us, but darn it, we're going to make sure we treat everybody in that room with respect.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you if you have anything to share with us from your own perspective that we haven't touched on tonight. We've gone through 19 questions, so done a lot of speaking. So
Um,
you'd
you
just
know,
like
I'm
to give us
I'm
something to leave something with us.
well, I guess I'd leave you just, thank everybody for joining this. And I think every time I've done an event with the league, I've made the same point, which isn't because I have nothing new to say, but because I just always feel this way about the league. Democracy is this fundamental bet that if everybody participates in elections and if everybody is informed, that we are going to collectively make the right decision more often than we make the wrong ones. And the if you don't fundamentally believe that, if you don't believe that all your neighbors, that their collective wisdom is better than the sum of our individual parts, then you don't believe in democracy. But that has always been it's always been something we have to fight to defend. If your views are not particularly popular, if social trends are moving against you, there's a tendency to get pretty upset at democracy. And I'm so grateful to the league for consistently being a voice that's out there that's saying we want to know where people stand. We want to make sure that our elected officials are transparent about where they are on the issues. And if you vote for them, if you don't vote for them, that's a separate matter. But we're also going to make sure you're registered to vote, so at least you vote for somebody. And that's the basic bet. And I think the most optimistic thing I can say about this moment that we're in right now is that democracy doesn't survive unless we keep working at it. And the stress we're in right now is non-trivial. But if that stress reminds us all to work at it a little bit harder, then we're going to emerge from this stronger than we went into it.
Well, thank you very much. The League of Women Voters of Elmhurst appreciates your taking your valuable time to spend it with us this evening. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and your vote is your voice, and that's something that the League firmly believes in. So thank you very much, Congressman Casten. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Patty. Thanks all for listening in.